All right, well, let's hop in and get started talking about our online engagement strategies. So, thanks everyone for taking the time out of your Monday morning to learn a little bit about this with me. My name is Tila Beischer, and I am a customer success manager here at Thoughtexchange. So, I work with thought partners in a few ways. First, I help them to plan and execute really successful exchanges based on their outcomes. And then I also help them with adoption in their organization. And by that, I mean having it spread to become a part of the decision making culture in their organization. And so, how can they really be leveraging their Thought Exchange account in the best way possible? The other thing that I do is host these events, and we host these events weekly. They're intended to be really deep dives of product knowledge, of information for you, so that you're supported in running exchange and in building really successful engagement. So, here's what we're actually going to talk about today. Today, we're talking about creating an online engagement strategy. And if you're here, you already know that Thought Exchange allows you to gather data and to make decisions really quickly. And it also allows you to be continuing all of your engagement efforts right now online. Right now, we don't have the option to do those more traditional in person stakeholder engagement methods. So, how can we pivot and Exchange account that we already have to be completing more of that work? And so, as a leader of any stakeholder engagement project, your role is to gather data from your stakeholders and then to use that data to inform project decisions. And so, all of that requires the online engagement component. So, today we'll be talking about how you can start to build trust, how you can build social capital with these online strategies, how you can design your exchanges really well. So, what can within the product you need to keep in mind? And then also, how can you really creatively communicate or promote your events, or your events promote your exchanges too? And so let's get started thinking about trust and thinking about engagements, how they impact your organizational culture. If you're here, you've probably heard some form of this before, but I want to make sure that we go through it really clearly today. And so if you think of where we're at in the world right now, we've all been working several months now. And as a result, oftentimes that means that there's silos. So there's different levels of local and individual knowledge that aren't being shared in the same way that they were being shared before. And what Thought Exchange does for you is it's going to allow you to really break down those silos, to break them apart, and to create one shared conversation. And because that rating step really demonstrates agreement and priorities, you're able to make really efficient decisions once you've broken those silos down. And I think that's really significant right now, is that there's a lot of uncertainty in the world. So how can you make certain decisions? And that can be having crowdsourced decisions can be the best way to make those, because you have a little bit of validity. You have your stakeholders backing you up in the decisions that you're making. And so then if you think about it beyond the business case of exchanges supporting with high ROI decisions, the other thing that exchanges are really is this concept of building social capital, leadership capital, and trust in your organization. And if you look at this here, we're looking at essentially Maslow's hierarchy of needs on this screen. And if you think of an engagement strategy and how that it would address any decision that you need to make, you're going to need to move through this path. And so you're going to have to start with stabilizing your stakeholders and make sure that everyone feels really safe, that the problem has been addressed before you can move on to steps like growing or inspiring together. And essentially, it's saying that we need to be able to address the base needs before we can think about innovating together. And when you're setting up your exchanges, you're going to really set them up in a series that moves through this pyramid. And I'll move to our next slide now. And this is kind of showing you how you can build an engagement strategy that moves through that pyramid. So if you start at the bottom, you're thinking about what are your trust. Right now, it's safety and security and structure and processes. People aren't feeling safe, they're not feeling secure, and they're not feeling confident at what is the actual structure that we're working in right now. What are the best processes to be supporting us? And so for you, thinking about building an engagement strategy right now, and specifically one that's online, you kind of have this unique challenge because you don't have those in-person interactions to actually gauge where people are at in terms of this hierarchy. So You can hear on Slack, you can hear how people are doing. You might hear things from emails or from virtual events that you're hosting, but you're not always going to be fully aware of exactly where your organization is at or your stakeholders are at. And so for you, it's about how can I consider what I think that we are at and then meet people where they are. And I love that concept of meeting people where they're at. It's we as leaders can sometimes think, okay, this is the decision, this is the conversation that I need to have to inform this decision. Whereas in reality, our stakeholders might not be ready to have that conversation. And one of the beauties of Thought Exchange being an open-ended question for every exchange is that if someone needs to talk about structure and processes, but you've asked a question about vision and purpose, likely your conversation will end up being about structure and processes because it is those open-ended responses. And so for you, sometimes what that means is a little bit of a pivot. It's you've gone out and you've asked about culture and transformation and maybe what stories are excellent examples of what is possible, but people are still feeling the safety and security. They're feeling, what do we need to consider with safety going back to work if we're thinking about transitioning back to the office? So even if you ask about those stories, people still might be talking about the safety, and it allows you to be really flexible in your engagement strategy there. You can jump between and you can pivot quickly too. And so if you're thinking about this concept of building trust, how can you do it? It's in building a really effective online engagement strategy that is built upon multiplicity. So you're running many exchanges frequently to empower your stakeholders to think of that as not just a decision-making tool, but a communications tool as well. And then you're also thinking about how many voices can you invite to the conversation too. One of the huge opportunities of Thought Exchange and of this online world, the opportunity to invite even more voices into the conversations. Think of something like a town hall example. This is something I chat about oftentimes as an example of the situation, but a town hall in the past, it was solely people who could physically make it there. And so if that means that you have people that were commuting at that time, that the meeting was scheduled, they weren't able to be there and to be involved in the conversation. If you have people who spoke languages that weren't being at the event, they may not come to the event because they wouldn't be able to participate. And even something as simply as people with mobility issues may not be able to make it to that physical event and therefore weren't invited into that conversation simply because they couldn't physically be there. And exchanges allow you to bypass that entirely. So you'll find that your stakeholder group can actually really broaden if you're really cautious about how you welcome those people into the conversation and start to market it really directly to them. So the value of this is that people who aren't always invited to our conversations are welcomed in now. They're able to have a voice as much as they want to as well. And another thing to really consider too is that the more frequently that you're listening to all of those voices and the more that you're demonstrating that the voices are valuable by doing things like sharing results back, using the summary reports that are in your Discover dashboard, you're building more trust and you're also supporting what you're doing as well because you're demonstrating all voices are valuable. And then all of this engagement effort would essentially be wasted too if you weren't practicing transparency with how it's impacting the decisions that you're making. And so for you, you're going to want to be really crisp and really clear with your participants about what happened in the conversation and what's next. And so that will look like leveraging those summary reports and editing some of the text, saying, we heard you, these were the top themes that we saw. This is what we are going to do as a result of this information. And what that does is it really helps people to see a set of expectations, not just for them in their participation, but for you as a leader of the exchange. They have expectations for how you're going to use their information, which ultimately means that they're going to be motivated to participate in future exchanges. And so if this goal of engaging often is something that we're articulating on, something that we're encouraging, and we want to avoid something like a survey burnout or a survey fatigue that we hear about in the survey world, what Thought Exchange allows you to do is to bypass that concept of fatigue and in fact to strengthen participation over time if you're being really transparent and truthful about closing out exchanges, so sharing results back, and then using the results of one exchange to plan the next exchange, so building a really strong sequence as well. So thinking about exchanges and your online engagement strategy, once you know where you're at in the hierarchy of trust, you know what you want to engage about, and you know why, you're going to want to get really clear on your objectives and the value of participating. And objectives are your why behind running an exchange. They're thinking about what do you need to know in order to make your decision, who needs to participate in the conversation, and what for success. And once you know those three details, you can use them to design every single element of your engagement strategy. And so that would mean that your communications plan would be informed by that. That would be including value props about what are those metrics of success. We want to hear from you about this because we are going to use the results to do this. And the more clear that you can be with participants, again, thinking about that expectation setting, the more excited that they become to participate and the more motivated that they are to be a part of this process. And I really want you to think about what does success look like in the context of this exchange, and for this exchange in the context of my wider engagement strategy. You're going to want to set some KPIs for yourself. So those are your key performance indicators of how many people do I want to be participating in my exchange? How many thoughts do I want there? What are the big topics that I need to have talked about? And if those things don't happen in my exchange, what do I do and how do I learn from that for the next one? And so, because every organization is different, this is going to look a little bit different for everyone. And what I would say is that as you look at your first few exchanges, you start documenting those things for yourself and thinking about doing some benchmarking. And so, if your objective is, I want 5% participation, I want 10% participation, what do you need to do on the communications ends of things to get people there? We're going to talk about a little bit, but that benchmarking and those objectives in mind help you to measure success in your online engagement strategy. I know that considering metrics for in-person events versus online events, it can be a little bit fuzzy. What's the divide? What do we want to pull over from here into our new strategy here? And for you, I think that getting really crisp, setting up 2 or 3 expectations for every single exchange allows you to measure and feel if you are meeting successfully what those goals are too. Thing to really consider with your objectives and your value add is who needs to be brought into the exchange. And the value isn't just on the decisions that are made as a result of the conversation. The value is if you're thinking about that hierarchy of trust as a secondary or tertiary value add or objective, the value becomes who did you invite in and how did you build equity in the conversation. And so how can you invite as wide a group of participants as possible to that no voices are left out and that everyone is welcomed in. And so if we're thinking about the product needs for exchanges, thinking about online exchanges, obviously every exchange happens online, but there's a few things that you can do, particularly in the period that we're in right now, to think about setting these up for a lot of the success. One is your introduction messaging right now, and that will ultimately become your introduction video. And what I want to really encourage you to think about how can you include those value add statements in your introduction messaging. So we always coach to have the 3 elements of introduction. So the why, the progress, and the call to action. And in your why, I would really encourage you to state the value of you participating in this exchange is X. Acknowledge the why of the ask, and then people are more likely to feel heard and to feel excited to participate too. The other thing that you're going to want to do is to set some really clear expectations on how the results will be used as well. We call that setting the progress. And that becomes more important than ever when you're thinking about designing a engagement strategy that has multiple exchanges, because you're wanting to set up expectations for multiple participation over a period of time. And so you might even want to harken back to your previous exchange or mention the next one that's coming up. The more that you can set up those value props, of where does this exchange sit in our broader strategy. And then the other thing to consider too in that introduction is, can you create an introduction video? I know that these can feel uncomfortable to create and they can be a bit of a challenge, but right now we're all kind of faced with this silo of loneliness, and online engagement is really effective, and we're also feeling a little overwhelmed with the volume of it. So how can you really strongly personalize your introductions and make it really clear that there's humans on the other side, and that can be your introduction video. So even if it's something as simple as you sitting like I am right now with your camera open and clicking on record, that can be a really good opportunity for you to just speak to what your expectations, what you hope to learn from the exchange, why you're running this, talk a little bit about trust, introduce yourself to people so that everyone feels welcomed. And I think that's also something really important to consider when you're about that pivot from in-person to online, is that in person, you're going to have those few minutes before a meeting to talk with people. And if you're sending out an online engagement, an online exchange, you're losing that opportunity to really have people tied to it. So the introduction video replaces that for you. And you can also think about doing thought exchanges live as well in the room. So for example, we're going to do one at the end of our call today just to do a challenge, but you could think about embedding them in any virtual meeting that you're hosting, anything that you're participating in. Exchanges don't need to be heavy. They can be something really light. It could be something like, what are your questions about the presentation that we gave today? And then just talk through the results. It allows you to really be leveraging that idea that the more frequently that you're running exchanges, the more that you're building capital and trust, not just in the product, but also in yourself as a leader wanting to listen to. And it also sometimes can highlight things that you may have missed as well. And so that can be a really beautiful way to inform meetings, to inform virtual events too. So I'm going to encourage you to make use of the presenter mode feature in your Thought Exchange account in any meetings that you're hosting. And we're going to tour that together. And there are resources that we have on how to use presenter mode. The other thing to consider too, when you're thinking about online engagements and moderation, is how you keep the conversation focused and on topic. And that's a really important detail to consider. We do have AI moderation, which uses a script to read through your thoughts and make sure that everything is focused. But the one thing that I really want to caution you on is to not censor anything. You want to really create expectations for the conversation to be focused, to be removing inappropriate words, maybe anything that identifies a person in, but to and in doing that, even if a thought is uncomfortable to read, if it's not hurtful or harmful, leaving it in will actually protect the integrity of the exchange and build trust. Whoever shared that thought put it in there for a reason, and removing it can make them feel that they're being censored. So the more that you can leave in and allow to exist as it is, the stronger that your exchanges will become as a result. So those are 3 product considerations: writing even more value-based introductions than usual, leveraging your introduction videos as a way to really humanize your exchanges, using presenter mode or running exchanges in meetings, and also being really cautious about your moderation are really strong ways to support this transition or this pivot to online engagement. All right, so thinking about creative communication, I do want to plug that we have a masterclass all about communication happening next week. It's not online, will be soon. And so you can attend that to learn in more detail all about online communications and how you can plan for things. But essentially, when you're thinking about communicating for an online engagement strategy, your objective is to be as creative as possible, to invite as many voices in, and to build as much equity as you can. And so there's 3 steps in every single exchange that you're going to want to build communications around. So one is the plan step. And at this point, you are welcoming people to the idea of Thought Exchange. You're promoting that it's happening. One is the live step. That's actually sharing the link, getting people in and sending things like reminder messages. And then one is the discover step as well. And that would be in sharing results back. And so at every single step, you're going to really want to iterate the value of participating, set really clear success expectations, and to be inviting as many voices as possible. And I think that, again, I mentioned this earlier, this is one of the biggest benefits of transitioning to a more online mode of engagement, is that you're able to welcome more voices in than you traditionally would with in-person engagements as well. And so when you're thinking about welcoming those multiple voices in, I want you to really consider, how does each stakeholder group need to be targeted with their communications? And so if you have a student group and you're wanting to build some student voice in your exchanges, if you work in education, how can you spend some time, maybe in a virtual classroom, getting students in there participating? If you have a organization with sites in different countries, how can you send out invitations that are just in that language of the country to break down that language barrier and get everyone into the exchange as well? Another thing too is how can you leverage multiple platforms to invite many voices in? So think about all the different ways that you communicate in your organization. Maybe you promote things live at town or at company meetings. Maybe you use a messenger service like Slack or like any Google chat as well. How can you be as creative about inviting in as many avenues as possible to welcome as many voices into the conversation? Perfect. And so, but another strategy that you can use beyond just posts on email, beyond just kind of Slack messages, you could also think about those peer networks that already exist in your organization. So how can you find champions in your organization to be promoting participation to their peers? Maybe you have managers spend a little bit of time at their next team meeting to get everyone participating in the exchange. Or maybe you really want to kind of broaden the access to this so that those champions are able to be running their own exchanges. You can explore that too. And in that way, you're almost building your online engagements to be broader and organization wide rather than single project wide as well. All right, and we've already talked about the importance of this, but continuing the conversation and circling back on results is one of the most important components of online engagement, because you don't just want people to share thoughts, to rate thoughts, and then everything kind of goes off into the ether. You want to be building trust by demonstrating listening and by showing that voices were heard, that they have a lot of value. And so you're going to want to do things like use the leader comments function, share out the word cloud, use presenter mode, and build out summary reports as well. And consider this as essential a step in your exchanges as welcoming people into the conversation. This starts to build your sequence. So you're going to go plan, live, discover, plan, live, discover, plan, live, discover. And if you're going through each of these 3 steps every single time, then they start to build off one another and become really iterative too. And so in that way, you're not just gathering data to make decisions, you're effectively building a continuum of transparency, a continuum of communication. And in that way, you're really starting to build trust too. And so I'm going to end the presentation today talking about the fact that bringing people together is Thoughtexchange's #1 goal. And in using it, it becomes your best to build trust internally and with any of your external stakeholders. You can start to build social bonds that contribute to social capital. And this mindset really transitions your virtual engagement strategy from a more reactive state, so, oh no, we don't get to do in-person engagement, how do we do that, to more of an opportunity state. We have this opportunity to hear from more people than ever before. How can we start to build stronger bonds that are going to outlast this period of remote work? I really hope that today's session was valuable for you into a more online-based engagement strategy. What are those things to consider to make sure that it's successful and so that everyone is heard? If you have any questions, you can reach out to your account manager or your customer success manager. And thank you again for taking the time to participate today. Saw some familiar faces online and some new ones as well. So hopefully we'll see you here next week on Monday. All right, take care, everyone. Thank you.